Number 1. The Asparn-Schletz massacre. 202 people who were never buried. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Neolithic farming settlement in what is now Lower Austria. Longhouses arranged along a central path, cattle pens on the outer ring, grain stored in pits cut below the frost line, a palisade fence enclosing the whole. The year is approximately 5000 BC. Nothing about the layout tells you anything is wrong. Then you reach the enclosure ditch. In that ditch, archaeologists working the site in the 1980s found the remains of 202 individuals. Not arranged, not interred with any funerary intention. The forensic term is deposited, placed without ceremony. Animal gnaw marks on the bone surfaces confirm the bodies were left exposed for an extended period after death, long enough for scavengers to work through them without interruption. No one came back to bury them. The demographic composition is the first finding that separates this from epidemic or famine. Children and young adult women are significantly underrepresented in the skeletal assemblage. They are not dead in the ditch, they are simply absent. Older adults, adult males, and the elderly appear in roughly expected proportions. Disease and starvation kill everyone in place. At Asparn-Schletz, a specific demographic was removed from the site before or during the event. Someone left with the young women and children, or someone took them. Wolfgang Antelweiser at the Natural History Museum in Vienna and colleagues documented perimortem trauma across the assemblage injuries at or near the moment of death. The wound pattern points consistently to blunt force impact to the posterior cranium, above and behind the ear, the blow delivered from above. The weapon most consistent with the wound morphology is a stone adze, a dense, narrow-headed groundstone tool standard across Neolithic farming communities. The implement used to break ground for crops was used here to break skulls. There are no perifractures in the assemblage. None. A perifracture, a stress fracture on the forearm produced when someone raises their arm to block a blow, is among the most reliable skeletal indicators of conscious self-defense. 202 individuals, and not one raised their arms. The pattern is consistent throughout the assemblage. Blows from behind, no defensive response recorded in bone. The forensic interpretation is consistent with surprise, restraint, or both. Some archaeologists have proposed that the remains represent epidemic death and subsequent site abandonment. The demographic gap, the targeted absence of young women and children, does not fit that model. Pathogen mortality does not produce that demographic signature. The forensic teams working today's mass graves in Bosnia, Guatemala, and northern Iraq use the same analytical framework applied at Asparn-Schletz. Wound direction, evidence of defensive injury, demographic distribution of the dead. They use it to distinguish massacre from accident, execution from epidemic. That methodology transfers intact across 50 centuries. So does the pattern it finds. 202 people, one ditch, no markers, no evidence that anyone returned. The settlement did not rebuild. Whatever Asparn-Schletz was before that event, it was nothing afterward. The same weapon type, the same wound site, the same complete absence of defensive injury appears again 200 kilometers to the northwest in a pit containing 34 more. Number 2. The Talheim death pit. 34 people who never saw it coming. If you had arrived at the site before excavation, there would be almost nothing to see: a shallow depression in the loam soil, roughly 2 meters deep, slightly longer than a man lying flat, at ground level, unremarkable. When the first excavation reached the bone layer, the site classification changed immediately. This was not a burial. Baden-Württemberg, Germany, 5000 BC. The pit contains 34 individuals, men, women, children. Both sexes and all ages, in proportions consistent with a residential population sample rather than a specific targeted group. The bodies were not arranged. They were deposited in overlapping layers, in a sequence consistent with being brought in batches and dropped. The last body placed on top of the others was not covered. Every skull in the assemblage shows impact to the posterior cranium, not the temple, not the forehead, not the face. The back of the skull, above and behind the ear, the blow coming from above. No variation in strike location suggests a chaotic, opportunistic fight. When wound location is this consistent across 34 individuals, forensic analysis has a word for it: methodology. The weapon is identical in type to the implement identified at Asparn-Schletz, a stone adze, ground stone, dense, narrow-headed. The same culture, the same tool, the same wound site, the same total absence of variation. 100 kilometers apart, roughly 2 centuries later, the match is precise enough to suggest not just the same weapon class but the same trained technique applied deliberately twice across generations. There are no perifractures at Talheim.
Not on a single.
34 people entered this pit without one recorded attempt to raise their arms. The simplest forensic explanation for that consistency across an entire group is that their movement was constrained before the killing began, bound, kneeling, or ambushed from behind without warning and without time. Christian Mayer at the University of Mainz and colleagues published the comparative wound pattern analysis across LBK massacre sites, demonstrating that the strike technique is reproducible enough to identify as deliberate and trained rather than situational. Whoever carried out these killings had either done this before or been shown how. There was a procedure. It was effective. It was applied more than once. Some archaeologists have proposed Talheim represents a mass burial of disease victims rather than a killing event. The wound patterns peri-mortem, clustered to a single anatomical zone, consistent in approach angle, do not support that reading. Forensic investigators examining execution-style killings today document the same physical signature. Posterior cranial impacts in a narrow anatomical band, no defensive wounds, all victims oriented consistently relative to the attacker. The geometry of organized killing repeats itself. Talheim is 7,000 years old. Its forensic profile is legible in any modern case file. 34 people, one weapon type, every blow from behind. Talheim and Asparn-Schletz together confirm the killing was systematic. What the killers did with their dead at the next site adds a dimension that simple massacre does not prepare you for. Number 3. The Ofnet Cave skulls. 38 heads and 2 nests of ochre stand at the entrance to a small limestone cave in the hills of Bavaria. The year is somewhere between 65,000 BC. Inside, on the cave floor, 2 shallow circular pits have been cut into the earth. Each is roughly a meter across. You cannot see what is inside them until you are standing directly over the edge. Then you can see 38 human skulls arranged facing west, dusted in red iron oxide powder. No bodies. Only heads. Ofnet Cave, the Swabian Jura, southern Germany. The site predates or is roughly contemporaneous with Asparn-Schletz. Ochre is iron oxide red mineral pigment used across the Paleolithic and Neolithic in funerary contexts on multiple continents. It appears at intentional burials from Africa to Siberia associated with deliberate, careful treatment of the dead. At Ofnet, it coats skulls that arrived here without their bodies. The bodies were never found. The separation happened before the skulls reached this cave. The cut marks established the mechanism precisely. Forensic analysis of the atlanto-occipital joint, the articulation between the base of the skull and top cervical vertebra, shows sharp force trauma consistent with deliberate decapitation using a flint blade. Many skulls carry additional cut marks on the frontal and parietal bones consistent with scalping. The soft tissue was removed before deposition. These are not skulls left over from decomposed burials. The tissue was taken off while it was still there to take. The demographic distribution changes the interpretation. Of the 38 skulls, the majority belong to women and children. Adult males are present, but in the minority. This is not the demographic profile of a military casualty event where adult males predominate. It is the demographic profile of a raiding party's return the population most likely to be taken, the population least likely to fight back. Christian Orskit's reanalysis of the skeletal material confirmed that the wound patterns are peri-mortem and irreconcilable with natural death, followed by post-mortem ritual treatment. The skulls were oriented uniformly, facing west. The larger skulls, adult women, were positioned toward the outer edges of each pit, the children's skulls toward the center. The arrangement was not random. The curation was deliberate. What that curation meant to the people who performed it is not archaeologically recoverable. Some researchers interpret the skulls as ancestor veneration community dead, maintained in a skull shrine as a form of ongoing relationship. Others read the demographics and wound evidence differently. These are trophies, the heads of enemies taken in raids and interred in a place of significance. Both interpretations require deliberate killing. Neither requires the outcome to have been considered atrocity by the people who arranged the skulls facing west in their red ochre beds. Ethnographic records from the Pacific, South America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa document head-taking as a mark of status, proof of victory, or ritual offering at pre-contact and early contact periods. It appears independently across cultures on nearly every inhabited continent. Ofnet places that behavioral signature in Mesolithic Europe 8,000 years ago. They kept the heads. At the next site, they did not keep the skull. They used the entire body. Number 4. Gough Cave, England. Skull cups at the edge of the ice. Imagine you are standing inside a limestone cavern in the Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, England, approximately 14,700 years ago. The ice sheets are retreating from Britain. Outside, open tundra, pale and cold, grazed by horses and red deer. Inside, firelight on the cave walls, the smell of smoke and rendered fat, and the bones of the meals left here. Most of the bones belong to animals. Not all of them. The people who occupied Gough's cave in the late glacial period were anatomically modern Homo sapiens, biologically indistinguishable from anyone alive today. They hunted horse, red deer, and aurochs with precision and skill. The animal bones they left behind show a consistent butchery sequence, defleshing cuts along muscle attachment points, percussion marks from cracking the long bones, marrow extraction. That sequence, a trained, efficient process, leaves a specific pattern on the bone's surface. Researchers have catalogued it across dozens of Paleolithic sites. It is well understood. The same sequence was applied to the human remains found in the cave. Sylvia Bello and colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London published the full forensic analysis in PLOS 1 in 2011, documenting cut marks, percussion notches, and surface scraping on human bones recovered from the same occupation layer as the animal remains. The butchery technique on human and animal material is identical, defleshing cuts on the skull cap, percussion marks on the long bones from marrow extraction, cut marks on mandibles where the tongue muscles were stripped. The processing sequence was the same. The final product was different. 3 human skulls had been modified beyond butchery. The temporal and parietal bones were removed in a structured sequence, the fractured edges smoothed and carefully worked around the circumference, and the resulting hemispherical basin, the upper portion of the cranium, was shaped into a functional vessel. This is not an inference from ambiguous evidence. The modification pattern is consistent with deliberate manufacture. The smoothing of broken edges required sustained, directed tool use after the initial fracture. Someone committed significant time and effort to making these objects. This was not starvation. The site contains abundant food animal remains throughout the same occupation layers: horse ribs, deer antler, aurochs bone, all processed and consumed in normal quantity. The caloric alternative was present and consistently used. The human material was not processed as an emergency supplement. It was processed because that processing was chosen. Some researchers have proposed that Gough's cave represents mortuary cannibalism, the ritual consumption of community dead as a funerary practice. The butchery marks are identical to those on prey animals, which is the central difficulty with that reading. Funerary practice rarely leaves marks indistinguishable from food processing, with skull cup manufacture as an additional step. Neuroscientists and forensic anthropologists studying modern cases of organized atrocity consistently note that the dehumanization required to process a person as raw material is not a product of primitive cognition. It is a behavioral choice available to any human nervous system at any point in history. They made cups from the people they killed. Gough's cave is one site, one period, one cave. The next entry answers what happens when the same process is applied to hundreds of people systematically over generations. Number 5. Herxheim, Germany, the processing site. Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany, 4900 to 4750 BC. Stand at the center of what was once a settlement enclosure and look outward. Around you, 2 concentric oval ditches define the boundary of the site. Those ditches are filled. Not with soil, not with refuse, not with the collapsed remains of structures, with bone. Sorted bones, skull fragments in concentrated areas, long bones elsewhere. When archaeologists describe the spatial organization of those bones, they compare it to the layout of a butchery site. That comparison is deliberate. The minimum number of individuals represented in the bone assemblage is 500. The site was in active use for approximately 150 years. That calculates to an average of 3 to 4 individuals processed per year, sustained across multiple human generations. That number is a floor, not a ceiling. The ditch fills have not been comprehensively excavated, and conservative estimates are probably conservative. Every human bone in Herxheim shows the same processing marks: defleshing cuts along muscle attachment points, percussion marks from long bone fracture for marrow extraction, spiral fracture patterns on the shafts consistent with fresh bone broken rather than dry. The sequence is forensically identical to the animal bone processing sequence documented at the same site where deer and cattle were butchered and eaten in the standard way. Bruno Boulestine at the University of Bordeaux and colleagues published the primary analysis in Antiquity in 2009, identifying the processing marks and mapping the spatial distribution of human remains across the ditch fills. Their conclusion is that these individuals were systematically defleshed, disarticulated, and their bones deposited in organized clusters across the full duration of the site's use. Not once, more than 150 years of it. Strontium isotope analysis of the bone material establishes where the individuals came from. They were not local. They originated from across the linear band ceramic world, from the Rhine corridor, from the Danube basin, from the northern plains, traveling up to 600 kilometers to arrive at this site. People were being brought here from across a territory roughly the size of modern France. This was not a massacre. There is no evidence of a single mass death event, no stratigraphic boundary in the bone layer corresponding to a single moment of killing. The bodies arrived at different times over 150 years, were processed, and their remains were deposited in the ditches. The site was a place where this happened repeatedly, across generations, with organizational consistency. Some researchers have proposed that Herxheim reflects ritual feasting on outsiders as a form of social or spiritual assimilation. Others propose systematic violence, a centralized processing site for enemies taken in long-range raiding across a wide territory. Both require 500 people from distant regions brought to one location, defleshed with the same technique used for food animals, and deposited in organized ditches. 500 people, 150 years. The same technique every time. The forensic documentation of Herxheim does not close the interpretive question, it closes all the comfortable ones. Number 6. The LBK Massacre Belt. The pattern your history class never named. Draw a line across a map of Central Europe from the Rhine Basin to the Vistula Plain, from what is now eastern France to the borders of modern Poland. Every major archaeological site along that corridor that has been systematically excavated shows the same evidence. Asparn-Schletz, Talheim, Vehingen, Widerstedt, Oberherxstedt. At least 8 confirmed massacre sites within one cultural tradition across 1,000 years. Look at the line. Then ask yourself why no textbook ever drew it. The linear band ceramic were the founding agricultural population of Central Europe, the people who built the continent's first permanent villages, cultivated its first grain fields, raised its first domesticated livestock in what are now Germany, Austria, France, and Poland. The story of European civilization routinely begins with them. The forensic record of their society includes multiple confirmed mass killing events distributed across their entire cultural range and their entire cultural lifespan. That part of the story is usually left out. The pattern across massacre sites is not random. Mixed-age victims, mixed-sex victims, no selective targeting of adult males alone. No evidence of plunder following the killing, no looted goods, no stripped ornaments or tools. The same weapon type appearing in wound signatures across hundreds of kilometers. Bodies left without burial. The operational signature of the violence matches across sites separated by both geography and centuries, with a consistency that requires explanation. Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization, published in 1996, presented the LBK massacre data as part of a global cross-cultural argument. That organized violence in pre-state societies is not anomalous but endemic, and that the archaeological record of the prehistoric period had been systematically read against the evidence to support a model of peaceful primitive life that the bones do not justify. The book was resisted by mainstream prehistory for nearly 2 decades. The sites continued to be excavated. The wound patterns continued to emerge. The published consensus has moved in Keeley's direction. Raiding and massacre were not episodic failures within the LBK world. The multi-site evidence positions them as recurring features of it, predictable operational behaviors of a civilization that has otherwise been characterized in school curricula as a cooperative agricultural success story. The LBK cultural system collapsed around 4500 BC. Across the corridor, settlements were abandoned. Researchers have proposed climate stress, soil depletion, and demographic pressure as causal factors. The violence record introduces at minimum one additional mechanism. Societies that sustain endemic raiding against themselves across a 1,000-year period absorb cumulative structural damage that compounds every other pressure they face. Primary and secondary school curricula in most Western countries still describe the Neolithic transition as a period of peaceful agricultural cooperation. The LBK forensic record contradicts that description. The academic consensus has been moving away from it for 30 years. The curricula have not followed. Europe's first farmers were also Europe's first organized killers. The LBK belt is one culture in one millennium. 5,000 years and 5,000 kilometers away, the same victim demographics, the same forensic signatures, and the same absence of plunder appear in a single field in South Dakota. Number 7. Crow Creek, South Dakota. 486. In 1978, a construction crew building a sewage lagoon on the Missouri River broke ground and found bone. The site was turned over to archaeologists from the University of South Dakota. What the excavation recovered is the largest known prehistoric mass grave in North America and one of the most forensically complete. Approximately 1325 AD, the Big Bend of the Missouri River. You are looking at an elongated pit, roughly the dimensions of a swimming pool. Inside, 486 individuals. Men, women, children, elderly in proportions consistent with a complete residential community. Every one of them was killed in a concentrated event or sequence of violence. The bodies were then laid in the pit and covered over deliberately. The grave was sealed by whoever was responsible for filling it. It remained sealed until 1978. The forensic profile is specific and systematic. Approximately 90% of the skulls recovered show scalping marks, cut marks running along the superior surface of the cranium at the scalp line. Evidence of dismemberment is present across the assemblage. Many bones carry perimortem cut marks and percussion damage consistent with mutilation at or near the time of death. The dead were processed after they were killed. The processing was not careless. A subset of individuals complicates the account further. Several skeletons carry healed injuries from previous violent encounters, earlier fractures and cut wounds that the person had survived. Some of the people in the Crow Creek grave had been through organized violence before this event. They had survived it. The advantage that survival represented experience, caution, network awareness did not protect them a second time. P. Willie at California State University, Chico published the primary skeletal analysis in Prehistoric Warfare on the Great Plains in 1990. The Crow Creek community belonged to the coalescent tradition. Villages of semi-sedentary farmers and hunters along the Missouri River. The isotope and skeletal evidence points to attack by a rival coalescent group organized, prepared, and thorough in execution. Not one person in that grave died of natural causes. The environmental context matters. The event occurred during a prolonged drought on the Great Plains in the early 14th century. Reduced productivity and competition for viable territory have been documented as precursor conditions for organized violence across pre-state societies globally. What the drought produced at Crow Creek was not a conflict or a negotiated resource dispute. It was the elimination of a community. All of it. Men, women, children, and the elderly who had already survived one round of violence and did not survive the second. Some researchers have noted that the deliberate sealing of the grave is unusual for a pure raiding model. It implies post-violence engagement with the dead that suggests a more complex relationship between the attackers and this community than straightforward enmity. The demographic profile, however, including very young children and elderly individuals, is consistent with a village assault rather than an encounter between mobile fighting groups. Crow Creek is one site on one river on one continent. The same victim profile, the same forensic signature, and the same behavioral logic appear in a river valley in northern Germany on a scale that required thousands of men to produce. Number 8. The Tollense Valley. Europe's first confirmed battlefield, approximately 1200 BC. Picture a narrow river, shallow, slow-moving, cutting through flat wetland in what is now Mecklenburg in northern Germany. The valley is quiet. It has been quiet for 3,000 years. In 1996, a diver surfacing from the Tollense River came up holding a human arm bone. Embedded in the shaft was a bronze arrowhead. What systematic excavation of the surrounding riverbed and banks eventually uncovered had no precedent in European prehistory. At least 130 individuals have been recovered from the site. The site extends for approximately 3 kilometers along the river. From that spatial distribution, researchers estimate the total number of combatants at between 2,000 and 4,000. The Tollense Valley is, by a wide margin, the largest and most forensically documented battle site from prehistoric Europe. Nothing comparable exists in the written record of the continent until centuries later. The weapons are not improvised. Bronze arrowheads of a consistent type standardized military equipment appear throughout the assemblage. Wooden clubs, spears, and a bronze knife recovered at the site represent a coordinated range of close combat and ranged weapons. Some arrowheads were found still embedded in bone, consistent with combat impacts rather than coincidental deposition. Strontium isotope analysis of the recovered remains is where the scale of the event becomes clear. The fighters did not all come from the same regional population. This was not a territorial dispute between neighboring communities. The evidence points to organized long-distance mobilization, a military expedition planned and executed across a significant geographic range. Detlef Janssen at the State Office for Culture and Monument Preservation in Mecklenburg led the primary excavation, with Thomas Terberger at the University of Göttingen contributing to the published analyses. The skeletal record preserves multiple phases of the engagement. Entry wounds consistent with arrow fire, defensive perifractures on forearm bones, and arrow wounds entering the posterior thorax and skull wounds on individuals who were running when they were killed. The battle had direction. It had a route. It had a pursuit. Alternative explanations: ritual deposition, accidental flood drowning, epidemic do not generate perifractures and posterior arrow wounds distributed across hundreds of individuals over a 3-kilometer riverbank. Europe had armies 3,000 years before it had the written word for one. The standard framework positions organized military logistics, supply chains, strategic mobilization, standardized equipment as products of state-level governance. States require writing. Writing reached Europe with the Greeks and Romans centuries after 1200 BC. Tollense places the full operational template of organized warfare in a preliterate Bronze Age society with none of the institutional infrastructure that template is assumed to require. The assumption was wrong. Today's military historians who analyze the logistics of ancient battles, troop movement, equipment standardization, tactical coordination recognize the Tollense operational signature. It fits inside their analytical frameworks without adjustment. The oldest evidence of ritual violence in this documentary predates Tollense by more than 7,000 years. It was found not in a grave pit or a river, but at the world's oldest known religious structure. Number 9. Göbekli Tepe. The temple built before farming, decorated with the dead. Sanliurfa province, southeastern Turkey. Step inside the oldest known monumental stone enclosure on Earth, T-shaped limestone pillars. Some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with animal reliefs in low and high relief. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, cranes. The structure predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It predates agriculture. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. They had no pottery, no domesticated grain, no permanent settlements anywhere within their range. They had organized religion and the labor coordination to raise limestone pillars. And since 2017, they have also been confirmed to have had ritual skull modification. During excavation of the site's filled deposits, the material used to deliberately close and bury each completed stone enclosure. A practice that formally ended each structure's period of use. Researchers identified 3 human cranial fragments carrying deliberate post-mortem modification. The bone was not broken accidentally or incidentally. The modifications are specific and take 3 distinct forms. The first, deep V-shaped cut marks running longitudinally along the outer cranial surface, produced by a stone tool applied with sustained, directed pressure. The second, bore holes, small, deliberate perforations drilled through the skull wall from the outer surface inward. The third, engraving incised geometric patterns cut into the bone surface. This exact combination in this configuration has not been documented at any other Neolithic or Mesolithic site anywhere in the world. Julia Gresky at the German Archaeological Institute, together with Julian Helm and Lee Clare, published the full analysis in Science Advances in 2017. Their assessment identifies the modifications as functional rather than incidental. The bore holes suggest suspension or display. The longitudinal cuts suggest repeated scraping that maintained the bone surface over a protracted period, and the engraving indicates sustained symbolic investment in the object. These were maintained objects. They were not discarded. The interpretation remains open. Gresky and colleagues proposed 2 primary readings: ancestor veneration community, dead curated and displayed as a form of ongoing relationship with the deceased, or trophy display, the skulls of enemies or outsiders treated as objects of prestige or ritual significance. A third reading, that these are executed individuals incorporated into sacrificial practice at the site, cannot be excluded on current evidence. What cannot be proposed is accidental modification. The bore holes alone rule that out. What is not in dispute is the date, 9,600 to 8,200 BC. These modifications predate agriculture. They predate pottery and permanent settlement. The people who performed them did not yet have cities, states, writing, or any of the organizational institutions we associate with the kind of systematic behavior the modifications represent. Violence arrived before farming, before literacy, before cities. It was present at the first large stone structure humans ever organized themselves to build. Some researchers caution that 3 cranial fragments from a site less than 5% excavated cannot anchor broad behavioral conclusions. The modifications are not disputed. What they mean is 9 sites, 9 different moments across 11,000 years, 9 different cultures with no documented contact with one another, 1 consistent behavioral signature, and 1 murder that remains the oldest forensically solved killing in human history. Number 10. Otzi the Iceman. The oldest murder in human history with a confirmed cause of death. September 1991. The Ötztal Alps, Austrian-Italian border, 3,210 meters above sea level. Two hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon found a human body protruding from the surface of a retreating glacier. The initial assumption was recent accidental death, a climber, a shepherd, preserved in the ice for perhaps a decade. The body was recovered under those assumptions. It was 5,300 years old, dated to approximately 3,300 BC. Otzi is the oldest naturally preserved human mummy recovered in Europe and among the most comprehensively analyzed human remains in history. Copper Age. A man of roughly 45 years. Well-nourished, well-equipped, carrying a copper-headed axe, a complete set of flint tools, and a longbow in progress. His last meal, eaten 30 to 60 minutes before death, consisted of red deer, ibex, einkorn wheat, and bracken fern. He was not fleeing. He was not starving. He had just eaten. In 2001, a radiologist named Paul Gossner conducted a new X-ray series at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology. He identified a flint arrowhead embedded in Otzi's left shoulder. The arrowhead had transected the subclavian artery. The wound caused fatal hemorrhage. Otzi bled out. The arrow had been fired from behind and below the angle of his shoulder, consistent with a shooter positioned at a lower elevation or at a distance behind him. He was shot in the back. Additional forensic evidence followed. A deep cut between the thumb and index finger of his right hand is consistent with a defensive wound from gripping an attacker's blade. Both hands carry healed injuries from earlier violent encounters. He had been in fights before this one. He had survived them. Whatever experience those earlier encounters had given him, it was not sufficient on this morning. The position in which his body was preserved face down, head resting on his left arm, on a flat rocky shelf is inconsistent with collapse from exposure or exhaustion, which deposit the body differently. It is consistent with falling where he was struck, forward quickly without controlled descent. He did not walk far after the arrow entered. This is not a cave full of sordid bones, not a mass grave sealed under 3 feet of soil, not a river packed with the remains of a battle. It is one person, one wound, one morning. Everything the ice preserved about his death, the stomach contents, the wound geometry, the body position survived without alteration for 5,300 years. What the 10 sites in this documentary collectively record spans 11,000 years. They begin at a temple built before farming and end with a man eating lunch before being shot in the back. A Neolithic village in Austria, trophy skulls in Bavaria, skull cups in Somerset, a processing site drawing bodies from 600 kilometers away, a mass grave in South Dakota, a Bronze Age battlefield in a northern German river, different cultures, different tools, different continents, different centuries, the same behavior, organized, deliberate violence leaving forensic signatures that outlast every other record the perpetrators left behind. The history of human violence did not begin with civilization. The evidence places it before farming, before writing, before the first permanent city. Civilization arrived into a world that already knew how to kill in volume, with method, and without leaving explanations. Otzi's killer was never identified. No witness left a record. The case remains formally unsolved. He died at 45 with healed scars on both hands. He had survived violence before. Whatever he saw coming that morning in the Alps, it was not enough. If this one was stayed with you, like and drop a comment with where you're watching from. Subscribe for more.